Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. The rain draped Gotham in a silver veil, soft and endless, whispering against rooftops and empty streets. Neon signs flickered through the mist, their glow reflecting in shimmering puddles that stretched along the cracked pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a horn hummed a low, mournful note, fading into the night. The city was never truly quiet, but in these hours when the world slowed and the weight of the evening settled, there was something almost peaceful about its solitude. Detective James Carr sat in his dimly lit office, the amber glow of a desk lamp pooling over a half-finished case file. His fingers traced the rim of a coffee cup gone cold, the bitter scent of it mingling with the faint musk of old books and rain-dampened leather. Outside, the neon glow of a liquor store sign painted his window in rhythmic flashes of red. He wasn't expecting company, not at this hour, and yet the softest creak of the hallway floorboards told him otherwise. The knock was barely a sound, just a hesitant brush against the wood, like someone unsure whether they truly wanted to be heard. James exhaled slowly before standing, his movements unhurried, as if the night itself had no need for urgency. He opened the door. She stood there in the dim light, wrapped in shadows, and a long coat that dripped rain onto the worn floorboards. Dark curls clung to her cheeks, her expression unreadable save for the quiet weight in her gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, her voice lifted, soft as the rain outside. "I think someone's following me." James studied her, his detective's mind already fitting the puzzle pieces together. Her hesitation, the damp sheen in her eyes that wasn't just from the weather, the way her fingers clenched at the lapel of her coat. He stepped aside, wordlessly inviting her in, and she hesitated before slipping past him. The scent of rain and something faintly floral trailing in her wake. The office felt warmer now, a contrast to the night beyond the glass. She eased into the chair across from his desk, her fingers tracing the edge of an old newspaper, as if searching for something unspoken in its ink. James sat down, the chair creaking slightly beneath his weight. He reached for a fresh page in his notebook, his pen hovering just above it. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice calm, steady, the way one might speak to someone standing at the edge of a dream. Outside, Gotham breathed in the hush of the night, the rain a lullaby against the restless city. She hesitated, her fingers still tracing the newspaper's edge as if it held answers she wasn't ready to read. The golden glow of the desk lamp softened the sharpness of her features, casting shadows that swayed with the rain-streaked light beyond the window. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "It started 3 nights ago." James didn't interrupt. He knew that in a city like Gotham, memories needed space to unfold. He watched her expression shift, the flicker of memory surfacing behind her eyes. I was walking home from work, she continued. Same route I always take. But that night, I felt it. Felt, not saw. That was important. James made a small note in the margins of his page, but kept his gaze steady on her, listening. It was the way the air changed, she murmured, almost to herself. Like a shadow stretching too far, like something moving just beyond my sight. I thought I was imagining it at first. But then the footsteps started. The rain outside thickened, drumming softly against the window, as if the city itself were leaning in to hear the rest. I changed my pace. So did they. I crossed the street. So did they. She swallowed, pressing her hands together as though to still them. I stopped in front of a shop window, pretending to fix my hair. And in the reflection, she trailed off, her breath slowing, as if caught between waking and dreaming. James leaned forward slightly. Did you see a face? She shook her head. No, just a shape, a presence. It was tall, standing just beyond the streetlight's reach. Watching, her hands curled into fists in her lap. By the time I turned, they were gone. But I knew they were still there. James let the silence stretch, allowing her words to settle. A phantom figure in the shadows, Gotham, had its share of ghosts. Some were real, some were imagined, and some, the most dangerous kind, lived in the space between the two. She exhaled, shaking her head as if trying to clear the weight of the memory. It happened again the next night, and the next. Always the same, just far enough away that I couldn't be sure. But I know. Her voice dropped lower. I know someone's there. James tapped his pen lightly against his notebook, considering. Have you told anyone else? She gave a dry, hollow laugh. And say what? That the shadows are watching me. Her gaze met his then, searching. Would you believe me? James studied her, then glanced at the rain-streaked window. In Gotham, the night held secrets like a closed book, its pages only revealing themselves in glimpses. He had spent years chasing whispers, unraveling mysteries that others dismissed as paranoia. And yet, those who doubted the unseen often paid the highest price. I believe, he said finally, that you were followed. Relief flickered in her expression, brief but undeniable. James set his notebook aside. You said it started 3 nights ago. Was anything different that day? Something new, something unusual. She frowned slightly, reaching back into her memory. She stopped, her lips parting slightly in thought. There was something. James waited. She inhaled slowly. An envelope, no return address, just left on my desk at work. Something in his gut tightened. What was inside? She hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket. Slowly, carefully, she withdrew a folded piece of paper, its edges slightly crumpled as though it had been opened and refolded many times. She placed it on the desk between them. James reached for it, unfolding it with deliberate care. The ink was faintly smudged, but the message was unmistakable. Don't look for answers you aren't ready to find. The rain outside whispered against the glass. And for the first time that night, James felt the city watching back. The message lay between them like an unanswered question, its weight pressing against the quiet hum of the rain outside. James ran his thumb over the paper's rough edges, studying the careful, deliberate strokes of the ink. There was no signature, no markings, just a warning, simple, direct, and steeped in the kind of certainty that sent a chill through even the most seasoned souls. He glanced up at her. She was watching him, her breath held just beneath the surface, as though waiting for his reaction to tell her what came next. He considered his words carefully. "You kept this," he murmured. "You looked at it more than once." She exhaled softly, a ghost of a nod. "I thought maybe I was imagining things, that it wasn't connected." But then the shadows came. James leaned back slightly in his chair, tapping a finger against the armrest. "Tell me about your work." "I'm an archivist," she said, brushing damp curls from her face. "At the Gotham Historical Society." That gave him pause. "The archives." She nodded. "I spend my days cataloging old documents, forgotten records, pieces of the city's history no one remembers." James had dealt with enough cases to know that Gotham's past wasn't just buried, it was actively hidden. Stories rewritten, names erased, events conveniently lost to time. The city had a way of swallowing its own history, leaving only shadows behind. "What were you working on before you got this letter?" he asked. She hesitated, as if the answer itself might change something. Then, finally, she spoke. "Blueprints," she admitted. "Old ones. A series of tunnels beneath the city." James stilled. "Most people know about the sewer systems and abandoned subway lines," she continued. "But this was different. Older, purposeful." She shifted slightly in her seat. "The blueprints were mislabeled, buried in a section they shouldn't have been in. When I found them, I requested clearance to examine them. The request was denied the next day." James rubbed his jaw, considering. "And then, 3 nights ago, the letter appeared." She nodded. The pieces were beginning to align, but the picture they painted was still obscured by shadows. Someone didn't want those tunnels rediscovered. Someone had been watching her the moment she found them. And now, that someone was making sure she knew it. James set the note aside. "Do you still have access to those blueprints?" Her fingers tightened around the folds of her coat. "I made copies." Of course she had. "Do you have them with you?" She shook her head. "No, I hid them." James could feel it now, the weight of something larger, moving just beyond the edges of sight. He had spent years following trails that led nowhere, chasing ghosts that dissolved beneath the city's neon glow. But this was something real, something buried deep, a slow breath, a decision made. "You're not going home tonight," he said. She blinked. "What?" "If someone's following you, They already know where you live. He reached for his coat, the leather worn and familiar beneath his fingers. You'll stay here until we figure this out. She hesitated, caught between gratitude and unease. Are you sure? James gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. I don't leave mysteries unfinished. Outside, Gotham exhaled in the hush of the rain, the city stretching long into the night, as if waiting for the story to unfold. The rain had softened to a whisper, threading through the city like a quiet melody as the night deepened. The room was warmer now, the scent of old paper and coffee mixing with the faint trace of rain that clung to her coat. James watched as she shifted in the chair, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the desk. She was exhausted, though she tried to hide it. The weight of uncertainty pressed against her shoulders. But now, in the dim glow of the office, she seemed to let herself breathe just a little. James stood, crossing to the small wooden cabinet in the corner, where he kept an extra blanket folded neatly beside a bottle of bourbon. He poured himself a measure, the amber liquid catching the light as it swirled in the glass. He glanced at her. You want some? She gave a small shake of her head. I should probably keep my thoughts clear. He smirked faintly. Fair enough. He took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in his chest before setting the glass down. I need to see those blueprints. Her fingers tensed slightly against the fabric of her coat. They're in a safe place. I don't doubt that, James said. But if someone's watching you, they might know where that place is. She hesitated, then exhaled through her nose. Fine. Her voice was quiet, resigned. But I'm not leading you there in the middle of the night. That would be asking for trouble. She wasn't wrong. If someone had been tracking her movements, they'd expect her to return to wherever she'd hidden the copies. Retrieving them had to be done carefully. James nodded, mourning then. A pause. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the quiet seconds between them. She shifted slightly. You really think I should stay here? He gave her a steady look. It's safer. For a moment, she looked like she might argue. But then something in her expression softened. The exhaustion was creeping in now, pressing against the edges of her careful composure. James moved to the old leather couch along the wall and tossed the folded blanket onto it. It's not luxury, but it's a place to rest. She hesitated before standing, running a hand through her damp hair. Thank you. He only nodded, watching as she crossed the room and eased down onto the couch, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Her body relaxed by inches, her breath evening out as the weight of the night settled over her. James returned to his desk, flipping his notebook open again. The note still sat there, stark against the worn wood. Don't look for answers you aren't ready to find. He had seen enough warnings in his time to know that this one wasn't meant as a bluff. Someone believed those tunnels held a secret worth protecting. And if Gotham had taught him anything, it was that secrets rarely stayed buried forever. The rain continued its lullaby against the window, and slowly the city folded itself deeper into the night. The night stretched long and quiet, the rain a steady rhythm against the glass. James sat at his desk, watching the glow of the streetlights filter through the mist, casting shifting patterns across the floor. He wasn't a stranger to sleepless nights. Gotham had a way of keeping its secrets awake. Across the room, she had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her breathing slow, the blanket wrapped tightly around her. Even in rest, her fingers remained curled, as if still holding onto something unseen. James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The note, the tunnels, the silent presence following her, it all led somewhere. He just had to find the right thread to pull. He reached for his bourbon, taking a slow sip, letting the warmth settle. Then a sound, faint, a shift in the air. James's instincts sharpened instantly. He set the glass down without a sound, his gaze flicking toward the window. The rain blurred the outside world into streaks of light and shadow, but something felt off. The street below was empty, too empty. He rose from his chair, moving carefully across the room, his steps silent against the wooden floor. He reached the window, tilting the blinds just enough to see. There, a figure barely distinguishable through the mist stood just beyond the streetlight's reach, unmoving, watching. James exhaled slowly, his heartbeat steady. He had been in this game too long to mistake paranoia for reality. Someone was there. He turned away from the window and crossed to the couch. He crouched beside her, speaking just above a whisper. "Wake up." Her breath caught, and she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, she looked disoriented, caught between sleep and the quiet fear that had followed her for days. "What?" "Don't move too fast," James said softly. "Someone outside." Her body tensed instantly. "Here." He nodded. "They're watching." She swallowed, pulling the blanket closer, as if the fabric could shield her from the weight of unseen eyes. James stood, moving toward the cabinet where he kept his revolver. He wasn't a fan of unnecessary violence, but he also wasn't a fan of being hunted in his own city. He checked the cylinder loaded, as always, then slipped it into the holster beneath his coat. "What do we do?" she asked, keeping her voice low. James glanced toward the window again. The figure was still there, unmoving, waiting. He turned back to her. "We don't lead them to the blueprints. We need to move, but carefully." She nodded, her fear controlled, measured. He had to admit, she was handling this better than most. James crossed to the door, resting his hand on the knob. Then, without opening it, he said, "If they wanted to break in, they would have. They want to see what we do." A pause. The rain whispered against the city, filling the silence. James turned to her. "Get your coat. We're going to make them follow us." Her brow furrowed. "You want them to follow. If we don't lead them to the blueprints, They'll keep waiting until we do. His voice was steady. We control the story. She hesitated, then nodded. All right. James exhaled, rolling his shoulders. The weight of the night pressed in, thick with unspoken questions. But he knew one thing for certain. Someone had drawn a line in the shadows, and now it was his turn to step across it. Outside, Gotham watched in silence, the rain sweeping the city clean of everything but its secrets. The night air was thick with the scent of wet pavement and city smoke as James stepped onto the rain-slicked sidewalk, his coat pulled close against the cold. She walked beside him, her hood drawn up, her hands tucked deep into her pockets. The street stretched ahead, empty save for the quiet hum of neon signs and the occasional glint of water catching the glow of passing headlights. But James knew better. They weren't alone. He could feel it, that subtle shift in the air, the presence trailing just beyond sight. Whoever was watching them wasn't trying to hide. This was a game, a silent dance played beneath the city's watchful eye. James had seen it before. The way shadows moved when they thought they were unseen. The way silence carried weight. They walked in silence, their footsteps softened by the rain. The city loomed around them, towering in steel and stone, its alleyways whispering with unseen echoes. James led them down a side street, where the glow of the main road faded into dim lamplight. He didn't speak until they reached a narrow stretch of pavement bordered by old brick buildings. "Take a breath," he murmured. She glanced at him, her brows knitting in question. He turned his back to the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, reaching into his pocket as if searching for a cigarette. His voice was low. "They're following, but they haven't made a move yet. That means they want something." She shifted slightly. "And if we keep walking, they'll keep following." James flicked an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve, scanning the reflections in a nearby puddle. A dark figure lingered just at the corner where they had turned. Still watching, she exhaled, glancing down at the wet pavement. "What do we do?" James pushed off the lamppost, his stance easy. "We see what happens when they lose sight of us." She hesitated, then nodded. Without another word, James took her hand not roughly, but with just enough urgency, and led her toward the nearest alleyway. The buildings loomed close, their brick facades damp with years of weather and neglect. A fire escape ladder gleamed under the soft glow of a flickering street lamp. James moved quickly, guiding her toward the nearest doorway, a recessed alcove barely wide enough for the two of them. The rain dripped steadily from the rusted awning above as they pressed into the shadows. The silence stretched. The only sound was the distant hum of a passing car, the low murmur of the city breathing around them. Then footsteps, slow, measured, the kind that didn't belong to someone simply passing through. James felt her tense beside him, her breath shallow. He gave the faintest shake of his head. Wait. The figure entered the alley, pausing just a few steps away. James caught the briefest glint of something metallic, a ring, perhaps, or the buckle of a coat. The figure turned slightly, scanning the darkness, sensing the absence rather than seeing it. Then, as if deciding something, they took another step forward. James moved fast. In a single motion, he stepped from the alcove, his coat shifting with the movement. The figure barely had time to react before James grabbed the front of their coat and shoved them against the brick wall. A sharp gasp, a man's voice, rough and surprised. "Who sent you?" James' voice was calm, steady, but edged with something firm. The man struggled, but James had the advantage. His grip tightened. "Talk." A smirk flickered across the man's face, even as rain dripped from his chin. "You don't want to go looking, detective." James narrowed his eyes. Looking for what? The man exhaled a quiet chuckle, his breath fogging in the cold air. "For things buried beneath this city. Some doors aren't meant to be opened." James studied him, the weight of those words settling deep. Then, just as quickly as he had spoken, the man shoved back, slipping free of James' grip. He moved fast, too fast, disappearing into the shadows before James could stop him. James stood still for a moment, listening to the sound of retreating footsteps fading into the rain. Behind him, she stepped out of the alcove. Who was he? James exhaled slowly, adjusting his coat. Someone who knows exactly what we're after. Her gaze was dark, searching. What now? James looked toward the street, the rain painting streaks of light on the pavement. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was still shrouded in shadows. "We get those blueprints," he said, "before someone decides we shouldn't." The city stretched before them, waiting, as if the night itself was holding its breath. The rain had settled into a quiet drizzle by the time they reached her apartment. The streets were empty, washed clean by the night, but James knew better than to trust the stillness. Gotham never truly slept, it only waited. She led him inside, her keys trembling slightly as she turned them in the lock. The apartment was small but neat, lined with shelves of old books and papers, the scent of ink and aged parchment mingling with the faint trace of coffee. A desk sat against the far wall, stacked high with folders and maps. The glow of a single lamp cast long shadows across the room. James shut the door behind them, locking it twice out of habit. Where are they? She crossed the room without hesitation, reaching for a small wooden box tucked beneath a pile of books. With careful hands, she lifted the lid and pulled out a bundle of folded pages, worn at the edges, the ink slightly smudged from handling. She placed them on the desk, smoothing them out under the light. James stepped closer. The paper was yellowed with age, the lines drawn with meticulous detail. He traced a finger over the faded ink, following the contours of the tunnels that snaked beneath the city. "These are old," he murmured. "How old?" She glanced at him. "Over 100 years. James studied the markings, the careful notations scrawled along the edges. These don't match the city's official records. She nodded. That's why I noticed them. The archives have a complete set of Gotham's underground systems. But this, she tapped the corner of the blueprint. This doesn't exist in any modern records. James followed her gaze. The tunnels stretched beneath Gotham's oldest districts, weaving beneath landmarks that had stood for centuries. But there, near the center of the map, was something different. A chamber, unmarked, no labels, no explanation, just a dark, empty space hidden beneath the city. James frowned. What's here? She shook her head. I don't know. The notes don't say. But whatever it is, someone went through a lot of trouble to erase it from history. James exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling in. And someone doesn't want you finding it. She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. Do you think it's connected to the man following me? James nodded, no doubt. The silence stretched between them, thick with unanswered questions. The rain tapped softly against the window, a quiet metronome to the tension in the room. James turned away from the desk, packing slightly. He had spent years chasing ghosts through Gotham's back alleys, unraveling secrets that were meant to stay buried. But this was something different. A warning, a presence in the shadows, a forgotten piece of the city's past resurfacing after a century of silence. Finally, he turned back to her. We need to see it for ourselves. Her eyes widened slightly. You want to go down there? James nodded. We don't have a choice. Someone already knows you've seen this. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it gets. She hesitated, the weight of his words settling over her. Then, after a moment, she squared her shoulders. All right. James studied her for a second longer, then nodded. We go at dawn. She exhaled softly, glancing at the papers once more before folding them back into their careful bundle. And if we find something we weren't meant to? James smirked faintly, the kind of smile that held no humor. Then we'll finally know what's been watching from the dark. The city stretched beyond the window, endless and waiting, as the night held its secrets close. The first light of dawn crept over Gotham in muted grays, the city slow to wake beneath the weight of the lingering rain. James and she moved quietly through the streets, their steps measured, their purpose clear. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and fatting neon. The world caught in that fleeting space between night and morning. She led the way through an older district of the city, where the buildings bore the scars of time, brick facades softened by rain, iron railings rusted at the edges. The roads were slick beneath their feet, reflecting the dull glow of streetlights that flickered uncertainly in the early dawn haze. James kept his hands in his coat pockets, his senses sharp. He could feel it still, the presence lingering just beyond sight. Whoever had been watching them the night before hadn't given up. They were waiting, They reached an alley tucked between two aging storefronts. She paused, glancing over her shoulder before stepping forward, leading him to a heavy iron grate embedded in the pavement. The edges were worn smooth with age, the metal darkened by time and rain. "This is it," she murmured. James crouched beside the grate, running his fingers over the rusted surface. The bolts were loose, recently disturbed. Someone else had been here. He glanced up at her. "You sure about this?" She hesitated for only a second before nodding. "I have to know." James exhaled slowly, then gripped the edges of the grate and pulled. It gave way with a groan of metal against stone, revealing a narrow opening beneath. A rusted ladder descended into darkness, the air below thick with the scent of earth and damp decay. James pulled a small flashlight from his coat, clicking it on. The beam cut through the black, illuminating a tunnel that stretched beyond the reach of the light. He tested the ladder, then looked back at her. "Stay close." She nodded, swallowing hard before following him down. The air changed the deeper they went. The city above felt impossibly distant, the sounds of Gotham muffled into an eerie silence. Their footsteps echoed softly as they moved forward, the tunnel walls narrowing around them, damp with time. The blueprints had suggested a network of passages beneath the city, but standing here, enclosed by stone, the weight of history pressing in, James could feel it. This place had been forgotten. They walked in silence, the only sound the distant drip of water against stone. James swept the flashlight over the walls, studying the markings etched into the surface. Old symbols, worn with age, a language he didn't recognize. Then up ahead, the tunnel widened into a larger chamber. The air felt heavier here, charged with something unseen. At the center of the space stood an old iron door, its surface covered in rust and faint traces of markings long since faded. She exhaled softly beside him. This wasn't on the blueprints. James stepped closer, running his fingers over the cold metal. The door had no handle, no visible lock, just the weight of years pressing against it. He could feel it now, whatever lay beyond this door. It had been sealed away for a reason. He turned to her. "Are you sure you want to open this?" She met his gaze, fear flickering beneath her resolve. But still, she nodded. "Yes." James tightened his grip on the flashlight, exhaling slowly. Then, with steady hands, he pressed against the rusted surface. The door groaned, the sound echoing through the chamber like a whisper from the past. And then slowly, with a breath of cold air from beyond, it began to open. The iron door creaked as it gave way, peeling open with the slow, aching resistance of something untouched for decades. A breath of cold air swept past them, thick with dust and the scent of damp stone. James lifted his flashlight, the narrow beam cutting into the darkness beyond. A chamber stretched before them, vast and silent, its walls lined with crumbling stone. Faint symbols marked the surface, their edges worn by time, their meaning lost to history. The floor was uneven, scattered with debris, broken wood, rusted metal, remnants of something long abandoned. She stepped forward cautiously, her breath shallow in the heavy air. This doesn't feel like part of the tunnels. James nodded. It's older. The room carried a presence, something lingering in the silence. Not supernatural, not quite, but a weight, as though the past itself had settled here and never left. James moved carefully, his steps slow and deliberate. The beam of his flashlight skimmed across the walls, revealing traces of old machinery, gears half buried in dust. And then, at the far end of the chamber, he saw it. A desk. Unlike the rest of the room, it hadn't crumbled with time. The wood was aged, but intact. The papers atop it yellowed, but undisturbed. It was as if whoever had been here last had left in a hurry, but never returned. She stepped closer, her fingers grazing the edge of the desk. A thick ledger sat at the center, its pages curled at the edges, ink faded with age. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the handwritten notes inside. Her breath caught James. He turned to her, his brow furrowing. What is it? She lifted the book slightly, turning it toward him. The name scrawled across the top of the page sent a chill through him. Wayne Industries. James exhaled slowly. This was theirs. She nodded, flipping through the pages, her hands shaking slightly. These records, they talk about a project, something buried beneath the city. But the details, she turned another page. They're vague. Everything's coded, redacted. James scanned the entries, the careful handwriting detailing shipments, construction schedules, restricted access points. It wasn't just a tunnel system. This had been something deliberate, something hidden. She swallowed hard. If this was Wayne Industries, do you think? James didn't answer. Bruce Wayne had built his empire on Gotham's foundations, but even empires had shadows. If this chamber had been forgotten, someone had wanted it that way. She turned another page, then stopped. Her face paled. Oh my God. James leaned in. The final entry in the book was different from the others. The ink was rushed, uneven. A single sentence scrawled hastily across the page, as if left in warning. We sealed it, but it's still alive. The silence pressed in. The air felt heavier now, the walls closer. James glanced toward the far end of the chamber, where the darkness stretched beyond the reach of his flashlight. Something shifted. Not a sound, not movement, just a feeling. A presence. She stepped back instinctively, her breath quickening. James, I don't think we should be here. James tightened his grip on the flashlight. The chamber suddenly felt too deep, the air too thick, as if something had been waiting all these years for the door to open again. He exhaled slowly. We're leaving. She didn't argue. She clutched the ledger to her chest and turned back toward the exit. James followed, his pulse steady, his mind racing. Whatever had been buried here, it hadn't been meant to be found, and someone, somewhere, was going to great lengths to keep it that way. As they stepped back through the iron door, the darkness behind them seemed to stretch just a little further, as if reluctant to let them go. And in the hush of the underground, beneath the weight of time and stone, something watched them leave. The tunnel felt different on the way back. The air was heavier, the silence deeper, as if something had shifted in the unseen spaces behind them. James kept his flashlight steady, sweeping the beam over the damp stone walls, his ears tuned to the quiet. She moved quickly beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around the ledger, as if it could shield her from whatever had been left behind in that chamber. They reached the rusted ladder, and James climbed first, pushing open the grate with careful precision before pulling himself up onto the rain-slicked pavement. The city was awake now, cars rolling past, distant voices cutting through the morning mist, but the weight of the underground still clung to him. He turned, offering her a hand as she climbed up beside him. She inhaled sharply, as if breathing Gotham's open air for the first time in hours. The ledger was still pressed against her chest, the final scrawled warning echoing in her mind. We sealed it, but it's still alive. James glanced down the alley. It was empty, for now, but the feeling hadn't left him. Whoever had followed them last night wouldn't just disappear. They had opened a door that wasn't meant to be opened. Someone, maybe something, would come looking. She spoke first, her voice quieter than usual. What do we do now? James exhaled slowly, running a hand through his damp hair. The ledger was the key, but it was written in half-truths and riddles, a puzzle with missing pieces. Wayne Industries had buried something beneath the city, and someone had made sure it stayed that way. He met her gaze. We don't talk to anyone, not yet. She nodded, understanding. If someone had already been watching them, then they were waiting for a mistake, a moment of carelessness, a loose thread to pull. James took the ledger from her, flipping through its pages one last time. The entries were precise, meticulous, until the final one. The rushed handwriting, the fear in the ink. Someone had been working down there. Someone had seen something they weren't supposed to, and whatever they had sealed away, they had been afraid it wasn't enough. She shifted beside him. You think this leads back to Wayne? James didn't answer right away. Bruce Wayne had been dead for years. His legacy was Gotham itself. But just because the man was gone didn't mean his secrets had died with him. I think, James murmured, that some things never really stay buried. The city stretched around them, humming with its usual rhythm, horns, voices, the rustle of wind through narrow streets. But beneath it all, beneath the pavement and steel, something waited. James tucked the ledger inside his coat, its weight solid against his ribs. He had been chasing shadows in this city for a long time. But this time, he had the feeling the shadows were about to start chasing back. as they stepped onto the main road, blending into the morning crowd. He cast one last glance toward the alley. The grate was closed, the tunnel hidden once more. But the feeling remained, that sense of something unseen, just beyond the edge of knowing, watching, waiting. And for the first time in a long time, James wasn't sure if Gotham's ghosts were finished with them yet.